In our reflections that we have been looking at on Laudato Si, we come now to a chapter that's entitled Integral Ecology. It's the shortest chapter actually in the Apostolic Exhortation, and what it does really is show that a combined approach is needed to answer any questions and problems about ecology. There are some thoughts on environmental ecology, economic ecology, social ecology, then cultural ecology, and the ecology of daily life, and then the principle of the common good, and it finishes with justice between generations. So it's a fairly wide-ranging chapter, although it's the shortest. An integral ecology clearly means that one respects the human and the social dimensions of ecology, as well as every other aspect of the global crisis. The exhortation has already said to us that all creatures are closely related. All creatures are closely related. And the different aspects, for example, of the earth, the physical, the chemical, the biological, they're all interrelated in some way. Ecology studies the relationship between living organisms and the environment in which they develop. Living organisms and the environment in which they develop. And by environment, we mean, he says, a relationship existing between nature and the society which lives in it. We are part of nature. We are included in it. And so it's not as if we were facing a double or two separate crises, but rather the one crisis, which is both social and environmental. And when determining the environmental impact of a particular undertaking or something that's some project, for example, due freedom, he says, must be given to researchers to interact with each other. He points out then the importance of each organism, each living being. Each one, as a creature of God, is good and admirable in itself. And the same is true, he says, of a grouping of these creatures or organisms. In other words, a kind of an ecosystem, a grouping of different organisms. These interact in dispersing, he says, for example, carbon dioxide, purifying water, controlling illness and epidemics, forming soil, breaking down waste, and in many other ways. These things happen through an interrelation and interactivity of different organisms. Economic growth also needs to be take into account a broader vision of reality than simply the financial. Again, it's coming back to this importance of other creatures and the interrelation between them. The health of a society's institutions also has consequences for the environment and the quality of human life. The institutions that exist for the family, local society, national and international institutions. They are there to develop human relationships and organize them in some way. And anything that weakens the institutions leads to injustice, violence, and loss of freedom. So they have their place, these institutions, in preserving and contributing to the quality of life. Ecology also involves protecting the cultural treasures of humanity in the broadest sense. There must be due attention to local cultures when studying environmental problems. Culture is not just what we have inherited, but it's a living, ongoing reality. And so, especially if there are problems, they need to be considered with the help of local people. And he has in italics, from within their proper culture. So he's stressing there, as you can see, that it shouldn't be just somebody from above or somebody from outside that decides on what's to be done in regard to ecological problems here, but rather everybody here should have a voice in finding this solution. Many intensive forms of environmental exploitation and degradation, he says, undo the social structures which shaped their cultural identity and their sense of community. So special care must be shown to indigenous communities and their cultural relations and traditions. That's especially true when there are large projects involved. Everybody must have a part, as I said, and even the locals, he says, should be the principal partners in any agreements. Authentic development also includes the effort to improve the quality of human life. And if, for example, an environment is not particularly good, human relationships, human love, and things like warm, friendly relations between the people can often counteract that to some extent. So, it's more what the people are than what the building or the city is like. That's important to keep in mind as well. In the cities you might have overcrowding, for example, you might have social anonymity, and that's where if other people come to the help of those who are in such situations, becoming friendly with them, then much good can be done. Love can overcome these difficulties, and sometimes they will lead to creative ideas as to how improvements can be made. So he also notes that if we're living, for example, in a suburb like this, that we're part of the big Auckland community, and we should see ourselves as such. We should see the city as a whole, he says, and regard all people as part of the we, which we are all working to create, to bring about a kind of a unity among all the people. That's something to be aimed at. He speaks then of lack of housing and the problem it is, which we all know. He speaks of the problems of transport and what problems are caused, for example, by too many cars on the road, leading to congestion, more pollution. And yet, if that's going to be solved, public transport needs to be sufficiently available to people, because if people are going to use public transport, they need to not be overcrowded, not be too inconvenient. Service should be frequent enough, and there must be safety. So overcrowding, inconvenience, infrequent service, the lack of safety can sometimes hinder people and prevent people from using public transport rather than cars. Another important aspect of ecology is the relationship between human life and the moral law. In other words, it's not just something here on earth, as it were, with no concern for our future or eternity. The moral law and its importance in our human life, accepting, in other words, that we are gifts from God, our bodies are gifts from God, our bodies interrelate with what else is bodily on earth and earthly, but we have more than a body, as we know. We are in relation with God. There is something for us in the future. And because if you leave aside the moral and the ethical law, then you might think, and some people do think, he would say, that they're in absolute control of their own bodies and of creation. And I think we heard a way back in the exhortation that's not the case. We don't have absolute control either of our bodies or of creation. What does the Pope mean in the chapter when he talks about justice between the generations? It means that we cannot use God's gifts in nature for ourselves only. We must consider those who come after us. And he quotes here the Portuguese Bishops' Conference, who said, "The environment is part of a logic of receptivity. It is on loan to each generation, which must hand it on to the next." So in thinking of the world that we want to leave behind for the future, we need to think of in a general direction. What is the purpose of our life? What is the purpose of all creation? That's something we have to reflect on. And then, what are we leaving behind us? Is it debris, desolation, and filth because of the very fast pace of consumption, because of waste, because of environmental change? Something has to be done now, he emphasizes. Action is needed now. And he finishes with a quote from the Benedict XVI, which says, "In addition to a fairer sense of intergenerational solidarity, there is also an urgent moral need for a renewed sense of intra-generational solidarity." What he means is that it's not just this generation, the next generation, the following generation, but within this present generation, we have the old, the middle, the young. There must be, he says, a kind of a solidarity between all these different groups. And Pope Francis put it in another way: as well as the poor of the future, we need to remember the poor of today. So he's urging immediate action on these questions. So that's chapter whatever it is. I say it's the shortest one, and it's all dealing there with the different branches, you could say, of ecology.